Good morning and welcome, everyone. I'm Paul Carson. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm the Training and Development Specialist with CareOregon's Pharmacy Department. And I'd like to welcome you to this morning's Meds Ed presentation that we're calling The Upside Down of Pharmacy Benefits. Because, friends, sometimes we know that it can feel like navigating benefits in the pharmacy universe can kind of feel a bit like being in some other dimension. Prior authorizations, step therapy, quantity limits, which way is up? How do the laws of physics apply here? How do you pronounce half of these different medications? It can be a little baffling, certainly baffling for our members, but let's admit it, it can also be confusing for us too. So today, our goal is to cut through some of that nonsense and turn things right side up again. We've got a really good program here for you today. Overarching learning objectives you're seeing on your screen right now. We're going to be talking about things like the prior authorization process. And of course, anytime you start talking about things like alternate dimensions, we have to start talking about glimpses into the future. And there's going to be a little peek into the future of how electronic tools will allow us to improve the prior authorization experience for you, which is pretty exciting. We're going to focus in on DME, durable medical equipment requests and benefits, including diabetic supplies today. And you're going to have a much clearer sense of the differences in pharmacy benefits between both Medicaid and Medicare. So we've got excellent information to help make that all illuminated for you here today. Here is an overview of our content along with some approximate timing this morning so you can see what you've got in store. All of our presenters are CareOregon employees today. So you've got the A-team working for you here this morning. It's going to be great. Our pharmacy paranormal explorers, if you will, shining bright lights of clarity and common sense on all these pharmacy interdimensional denizens so that they are easier to understand. But you can take a good look here and see what the timing looks like. We will try to, if we have a little extra time at the end, we're going to use the chat feature of our presentation here in Microsoft Teams to be able to have a Q&A session with our presenters at the end. So at any point during our presentation today, feel free to use that chat window to ask questions, and we'll collate them so that we can clear things out. We've been approved for both CME and CEU through the American Academy of Family Physicians and the Oregon Board of Pharmacy and the National Association of Social Workers. So if you need CEUs for my LCSW friends and the like, we got you all hooked up, and I'll explain how that process works at the end of our program here today. Very simple, very easy. Wanted to also, while I've got you here at the front end, give you a preview of some of the content that we will be presenting to you next year in 2023. Right out of the gate, we're going to be talking about the fentanyl epidemic and providing some current tools to help address that. We're going to be talking more about equity, of course, this next coming year, and how health literacy can work for you on that. And since we've covered it the last time, there have been quite a few robust improvements to medications that help address heart failure. So we are really fortunate to have some phenomenal presenters who are going to be talking about that. So look forward to that, and you can always check our program webpage that you see on that lower part of the screen there for the latest information and to enroll in any of our courses. We're going to get started here with our first presenter, folks. So thank you so much for your patience, and let me go ahead and introduce Cory Bradley, who's going to take things off and launch this rocket into space. Cory Bradley, PharmD, is the Pharmacy Operations Manager here at CareOregon. Cory received his training at Oregon State University College of Pharmacy. His professional interests include population management and healthcare data analytics. Now, Cory's worked on projects such as the Hepatitis C Patient Care Program and leads our Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee, that P&T committee that you often hear referred to. He is the agenda coordinator for the P&T committee and helps make sure that no icebergs are struck in the course of our ongoing voyages. Cory also claims to be the only avid sports fan in CareOregon's pharmacy department, but I know that's not true. So you may occasionally see his love for data analytics and baseball stats collide somehow, depending on what season of sports we're involved in. But all I know is when it comes to medication management, Cory always hits a home run. So please join me in welcoming our first presenter this morning, Cory Bradley. Take it away, Cory.
Thanks, Paul. I appreciate the warm introduction here. Again, my name is Cory Bradley, preferred pronouns he, him. Appreciate everybody joining today. I do want to kind of maybe start off with just a little bit of the approach, because these are really nuanced topics. It's hard to speak in absolute certainties, so I'm not going to try. I'm going to speak in some broad brushes at times, just for the sake of today's conversation. Really, about any one of these slides, we could probably turn into a 1-hour topic discussion. And, really, I don't think anybody wants that. So we're going to try to hit the highlights in a medium amount of detail. Really encourage people, if there's anything that you want more information on, more discussion on, throw it in the chat. Use of that Q&A session towards the end will be fantastic. So hoping that we can cover a lot of good ground today. I'm also hoping to speak fairly transparently. Some of these topics are uncomfortable. Talking about cost and healthcare is always a tricky subject. So I'm going to try to be fairly transparent and speak fairly honestly. Where I speak from is from my experience at CareOregon. I've been here for 11 years, so pretty much all of my experience is Medicaid and Medicare. We'll mention some commercial insurance topics, but just kind of full disclosure, that's not my area of expertise, but we hope we can cover it in just enough detail to help be relevant outside of our specific lines of business as well. My first tip is I want to tell everyone the key to pronouncing drug names is just say it with extreme confidence. Just own it and go for it. Truly, I don't think anyone knows how to pronounce the drug names, especially some of the newest ones. So just say it with confidence and you'll be fine. Let's go ahead and get started if I can advance my slides. All right. So I am going to take through a couple of different sections, I guess, settle into the tone of my voice, because you'll hear from me for a good first hour or a little over. And for me, it's important that we take a look from a couple of different perspectives to fully understand benefits and our approach. And so there's going to be some overlap, some foreshadowing, and some topics that we kind of build on and kind of hit on over multiple kind of perspectives. So I hope that helps it all make sense, because at least from the CareOregon experience, and I'll mention this probably more than once, we are a nonprofit entity and really about serving our membership, our Medicaid and Medicare populations, and doing the most good we can for the entire population. Being nonprofit makes me feel really good about what we're doing. And so what I want to start with is the why, to try to help people understand why insurance exists. I know often insurance kind of has sometimes I feel uncomfortable. People ask what I do for a living. I try to explain in fancier terms, and people seem confused. And then I say insurance, and then they're like, "Oh, okay, they get it now." But there's a little bit of a stigma, and I hope to break that a little bit. I hope that we can help people understand kind of the role we play and why we play it. So with that, let's jump into the slides here, and starting specifically on the why. Really, why things are done the way they're done, and the end goal. Obviously, as I mentioned, reducing costs. That's always the elephant in the room. Insurance are the payers. And so cost certainly is a big factor. Though, as we'll discuss, it's more than cost. Really, it's value. It's the relative outcomes and improvements in healthcare relative to those costs that are the most important, not just necessarily the straight costs themselves. And I know maybe going to get some eye rolls, like my 8-year-old who just learned to do and gave a famous eye roll to her mother this weekend. So that was a fun experience, but improving care. I know, again, maybe some groans there, but really there are some examples with the prior authorization process. It's not always just about cost. There are opportunities for us to make sure that regimens are maximized, the patient's being adherent. Maybe we spot some interactions with other medications or a different prescriber is writing for something the requesting provider is unaware of. So there really are some opportunities for us to help improve care as well through the PA process. And again, maybe another eye roll here, the insurance guy, value to society, but I honestly believe this because the pharmacy pricing world, it's difficult, it's nuanced, it's complicated, and at times it's very shady. So having experts, if you will, people whose full-time position is to focus on cost and value and cost effectiveness, I think is really important. And I think people kind of sometimes undervalue what that ultimate role can be to society and helping keep costs low when we all know healthcare costs are already quite high. And just a couple of quick examples, cherry picking a couple here. Did you know there's a metformin EO 1,000 milligram tablet out there that's 206 times more expensive than using a 500 milligram ER tablet? And, you know, I would think most people, you'd see that ER 1,000 milligrams, that seems like standard prescribing. That's normal dose, the single pill. Why would you want to take 2 of the 500s if you can take 1 of the 1,000, or take them twice a day? But the reason is that huge cost. So even just as of a few years ago, we had one member on this costing thousands of dollars a month for metformin. So it just kind of shows, again, things that don't stand out as obvious. You wouldn't know that. I wouldn't expect a prescriber to know that and to try to manage and navigate it. Within Concerta, for those familiar, Concerta is a stimulant medication for ADHD. It's now available as a generic. And if we looked at an adult, probably on a 72 milligram dose, so that is a higher dose, but there are kind of 3 different ways to get there. There's almost 3 different formulations available out there. There is a 72 milligram generic Concerta, and I should have used air quotes. I guess I have my video on today, so you can see me do air quotes. That 72 milligrams was not part of the original Concerta lineup, if you will. So that's a late addition where the pharmaceutical industry gets a new strength approved, puts a generic name on it, but essentially it's a quasi brand. And so that 72 milligram generic Concerta, again, my air quotes, $19 per day if you write for that single 72 milligram. Versus some other formulations that get a little more close to kind of true generic Concertas. There's one that's similar, but ultimately lost its kind of authentic generic status. That's going to cost about $7 a day, just a little under. And the true generic Concerta gets all the way down to $2.40 per day, basically. And so again, it may seem like we're nitpicking on a formulary side and providers getting frustrated that we only cover this one specific kind of generic Concerta, and it can be hard to navigate sometimes. It's hard to find that option. But you can imagine if we've got hundreds or even 1,000 kids in adults using generic Concerta, this difference in a $16, $17 per day can really add up to huge impact on overall costs in healthcare. So sometimes it is annoying. I'll admit that. I know it's frustrating with drug formularies. But this just helps kind of exemplify why, you know, usually there's a good reason. And I believe strongly at CareOregon that we should always be able to speak to that reason. Why do we do what we do? If we can't make a good argument, if we can't articulate it, we're always willing to look at changing it. So that's kind of always a challenge to our team. I honestly believe that CareOregon does it the right way. Now, that doesn't always mean that we agree with providers or providers agree with us. But again, I hope by the end of this whole talk, you'll kind of understand where some of those tensions come from and what our thought process is and where that's what that's based in. Let's define a little bit on kind of some formulary and PA criteria nomenclature. So for those that are familiar, formulary, pretty common term in pharmacy. It's kind of that list of preferred drugs. Really, it's kind of the advertisement. These are the products that the plan encourages to be covered. How literal that formulary is mandated or required can vary by the line of business or the specific health plan. So some might be set up, it's truly just a preference. All the provider needs is to let them know they don't want to use that one. I want to use a different one. Okay, that's good enough. Kind of a provider prevails. Kind of the medium category is exceptions are considered, have to be considered. However, it's on the provider to essentially demonstrate or convince us that the alternatives are not medically reasonable or appropriate. So they've truly been failed or truly there's a reason they're safe or effective, but that rationale can be scrutinized. The last option, which you might find more commonly in commercial insurance, is kind of this is the list, take it or leave it. There's nothing available off the list. And for us at CareOregon with Medicaid and Medicare, we're probably more in that medium category, maybe a little bit of a difference. Medicaid, we might scrutinize the rationales a little bit more. So we're not a provider prevails, but we absolutely consider things that are off formulary. So just because it's not on our formulary or that preferred drug list, we are required to consider those. Those go through the prior authorization process. And that's where the nomenclature starts off getting a little bit confusing because there is the term PA, it can be used in a lot of different ways. And PA criteria typically means it's on the formulary, but prior authorization is going to be required. Those drugs on the formulary with PA, that means there's going to be a defined set of criteria that have to be met before that drug is covered. So again, just because a drug is on a formulary does not mean it's immediately going to be covered or approved. That PA means it's going to have to go through that review process. That review process can look very similar to that formulary exception. So again, that's where that both things require a PA. Those that are formulary with PA criteria and those that are non-formulary, they both have to go through that prior authorization process. So that's where that kind of commonality exists. They both have to go through that review. Where it's different is non-formulary typically won't have defined criteria. It's a little bit more subjective. It could be a little bit harder to know what the health plan is going to look for, because it's kind of at the discretion of that clinical reviewer to say what are appropriate alternatives. Obviously, looking within a drug class is the first place to start, but it's not always going to be limited to just that drug class. So for treating diabetes, and some examples coming up, we might look at all the options to treat diabetes, not specifically just the drug class in question. The last one is kind of a subcategory of PA criteria is step therapy, or STEP often shows up on formularies as kind of this ST. Step therapy truly is just kind of a form of PA criteria. It's really abbreviated. It's typically only or exclusively looking for drug alternatives. By only looking for preferred alternatives, the claim system can do the heavy lifting for us. So we can say, well, let's use a heartburn example, GERD, with the PPIs, proton pump inhibitors. Maybe lansoprazole has a step therapy where it's looking for omeprazole. So it's kind of PA criteria asking that omeprazole be tried and failed. What the step therapy could do is to see that omeprazole in the patient's claim history and say, oh, okay, we see omeprazole, it's probably been failed. We can just give lansoprazole without going through the PA process. So it can help kind of a middle ground, a hybrid between a full PA, something that's a little bit more accessible to providers, but it's going to have less scrutiny from the health plan, and maybe we can cut back on the number of actual PAs the provider has to submit. The downside to step therapy is you don't get to evaluate other aspects that the health plan might care about. Maybe there's an indication that wants to check. Maybe we want to know what specialist is involved because we think it needs to be a specialist, or maybe we're okay with it being primary care. Or maybe there's lab values that we want to review. So I would say within our Medicaid line of business, most of the time, and we'll talk a little bit of why this is, we're looking at indications a lot. So most of our drugs will fall in the PA criteria, not necessarily step therapy. Medicare, Viet we'll speak to later, might use step therapy a little bit more. And a quick tangent on step therapy, sometimes we use it in creative ways as well. So for example, let's say there's a medication or a vitamin supplement that we want to have available to our members that have cystic fibrosis. We might do a step therapy logic to look for medications used to treat cystic fibrosis to pay that claim. That's not to say we're trying to make them go fail a cystic fibrosis medicine to get that multivitamin product. It's just kind of a creative way to use the claim history to make some assumptions about their diagnosis to kind of speed up and access to care. So sometimes we use that step therapy and kind of that creative logic. All right, the next part of a formulary you might be aware of, quantity limits. And I created kind of two buckets here. Again, another kind of broad brush description of where quantity limits come from. I'd say most commonly they're about how it was approved by the FDA. It's only taken once a day. Max dose is 80 milligrams. And so there are kind of some finite restrictions about kind of based on appropriate and maybe safe use. Typically, those are on a per day basis. Again, 1 tablet per day, no more than 80 milligrams, that kind of thing. Another option is benefit limits. These can be a little bit more arbitrary, but can also be based in evidence. So basically saying the health plan decides we only want to cover something maybe so often or for so long. Common examples here might be a glucometer. You only get one, maybe every 2 years because we think it should last that long. Of course, if a glucometer breaks and we need a new one, going through the prior authorization process to demonstrate that could be grounds for giving an exception to that quantity limit. Another example could be smoking cessation. Typically, there's limits just to say if you haven't stopped smoking after this 3 or 6 month trial, maybe we want you to try something else. So some of those can be based in evidence. Again, maybe a smoking cessation, if not achieved by 6 months, maybe the evidence says continuing to take Chantix for a full year isn't going to help. So sometimes they're arbitrary, sometimes they're evidence-based, but those kind of benefit limits tend to be more over time. Another example that's pretty common out there is Zolpidem, typically only covered for a few days per month, just to try to address the fact that chronic use of Zolpidem might not be appropriate, or maybe it's a safety issue in particular for female genders. All right, so a couple of examples, just how this all ties back together. In particular, trying to demonstrate the difference between formulary without a PA, with a PA versus non-formulary. So if we look within diabetes, and this is by no means comprehensive, this is a really specific example, really streamlined down. Metformin, really one of those primary first-line agents for us. Formulary, no PA, unless it's that 1,000 milligram ER tablet. That one's definitely non-formulary, so you're not going to find that one. But a lot of the other strengths and dosage forms are available. Then the SGLT2 inhibitors, one of the more common brand-only classes, because it's brand-only, it does tend to be quite a bit more expensive. So it does require prior authorization. We are going to look to make sure that a couple of alternatives have been tried and failed, or if there's a clinically compelling indication, the SGLT2 inhibitor needs to be used. And we'll touch on that a little bit later as well. Within that same class is Jardiance. Jardiance is quite a bit more expensive for us than Steglatro, so it's non-formulary. So Jardiance kind of has that additional built-in preference. Not only are you going to have to do Steglatro, you're also going to have to meet the criteria for Steglatro. So it's just kind of showing the variations of how you can have things with PA versus non-formulary and how that creates some subtle differences in preferences. The last one's not a huge player for us. And again, we'll get into this with our specific lines of business a little bit more. Cost sharing, copays, coinsurance. Often this ties back to tiering. So these are just elements of passing essentially some of that cost back to members. And there's kind of some advantages, one from a cost perspective, obviously, but really I would say it's almost another tool in utilization management. If I want to prefer metformin over Steglatro, if I'm a commercial insurer, maybe I offer that metformin with a $0 copay. That's an incentive for the member to use an agent that's less costly for the entire system. Maybe Steglatro, then maybe I've got a preferred brand status on it, and that's going to be a $25 or $50 copay. But if you want to go use Jardiance, maybe that's a 50% coinsurance. So you've got to pay half of that amount. If you have those tierings in that made-up scenario, kind of a tier 1, 2, and 3, that can do some of the heavy lifting for you. Maybe a health plan that has access to copays in tiering can rely more on that to drive utilization where they want it than, for example, our Medicaid line of business, which we don't have copays in Medicaid. And so typically what you'll find with CareOregon, we may have to rely more heavily on a formulary and PA criteria management to kind of facilitate these preferences and that classic utilization management. So that might be at times why Medicaid feels or looks a little bit more restrictive. It's because we don't have these copay, tiering, coinsurance principles to help enforce some of the preferences. So there's good and bad parts to that. Of course, obviously from an equity standpoint, not having copays helps make medications really accessible. But again, then makes it a little bit harder for us to how do we manage kind of preferences and priorities and kind of incentives, if you will. Now I'm going to get into the slides that might be get me into a little bit of trouble. So I'm going to, again, acknowledge these as my opinions and speaking with a bit of a broad brush. But I wanted to tackle a couple of myths or things that I think stand out. Maybe we see in the PA process, things that people don't fully understand all the time. We'll start with the first one, that FDA indications are all that matter. And this is kind of that concept that a drug has to be used for its FDA indication. And I want to put out there, that's not necessarily true. So a drug typically does have to be FDA approved. It has to have gone through the FDA review process and determined safe and effective for at least one indication. It has to go through that first in order to be eligible to be added to a pharmacy benefit. Whether or not that specific indication has to be used can kind of vary. We do support off-label use for both Medicaid and Medicare, though it has to be a supported use. And typically that definition, it can vary by plan. When we say compendia, normally we mean kind of like national drug database kind of resources. Micromedics is our big one. AHFS is another one. And these are resources out there to help identify what off-label things have been demonstrated to be effective. And because it's important to know that the variations on what consider something to be effective will vary by line of business. So Medicaid can offer a little bit broader brush there, give a little bit more access, I guess, if you will, to what considers something effective, but it still has to be reasonable. So for example, let's say a New England Journal of Medicine article comes out. It's got 500 people in it, and it was a randomized trial. That article could likely be used to demonstrate effectiveness in a Medicaid prior authorization process. But let's say it's a single report that somebody put about an interesting patient they took care of and how something worked for that single member. Yes, it's published, but that's still not meeting levels that we would accept to show effectiveness. So a little bit of a sliding scale there, but just pointing out we do accept off-label uses, but not all of them. The next one speaks to a little bit of kind of the classic three monkeys: hear no evil, speak no evil. But then I kind of allude to once you see it. So things that are on the formulary that don't need PA, obviously we don't have insight to the indications being used there all of the time. However, we are closely monitoring a lot of these claims. And there have been some notable examples where we see the use, we're not comfortable with it, we don't think it's safe or appropriate, maybe it's very costly, and it forces our hand essentially to restrict something that otherwise we wouldn't. And I point this out really to, again, help kind of put some context in how we approach off-label indications, but also point out this is sometimes why you look at something and say, why in the world does that require prior authorization? Or why isn't that on formulary? And sometimes it's because we saw inappropriate use when we let it exist without any sort of oversight or management. And a couple examples: ivermectin. Obviously, I would imagine most people are familiar with some of the controversy when COVID-19 first came out and using ivermectin. State fee-for-service moved to limit ivermectin to kind of combat some of that due to lack of evidence. For a long time, CareOregon, we left that alone. We didn't see a problem in our claims. We didn't want to disrupt access for those using it for other purposes. But now more recently, we noticed a member has used it for chronic COVID at a high dose, costing about $800 a month. It's probably going to force our hand to do something, add a quantity limit, put a PA on it. And so just speaking again to some of these uses, it ends up forcing us to kind of that classic, one bad apple kind of ruins the, now I've forgotten the entire phrase. One bad apple spoiling it for everyone. Chromium nebulizers is another one we've seen, another one that surprises people that's non-formulary. But the reason there being some inappropriate use in terms of very high quantities with some questionable diagnoses. So we do still cover it, but we make it go through the exception process. What's the indication? Who's asking for it? What's the quantity limit to make sure we think it's safe and appropriate? Another option I remembered as I was preparing for this talk, and I didn't put it on the list here, that I think is really kind of a fascinating one. Toby Nebs. It's a nebulizer solution used for cystic fibrosis. And that solution is something that we never manage. We just, for cystic fibrosis, why would we need to do anything about that? A couple of years ago, it came to our attention that a common practice became foot baths. These were kind of home compound kits. So pharmacies would fill a variety of ingredients, often, I might suggest, of higher ingredient cost, and send the patient home with these 2, 3, or 4 ingredients where they would mix it home and I guess put their feet in it. I'm still not 100% sure what they do with it, but we had these Toby nebulizers. So these are products that are priced for cystic fibrosis, which means expensive. Thousands of dollars in these solutions that were being dispensed, cracked open, and mixed at home to use as a foot bath. And now maybe some really believe in whatever that indication is. We did not agree with that use. Do not think that's appropriate use. Do not think that's a good use of Medicaid dollars. So we had to put that prior authorization. That may be one of those step therapies I mentioned to you before, where we don't want to impair access to those that need it for cystic fibrosis, but we had to take action to cut down on inappropriate use. So again, just making the point that, again, it's not always about, that we're trying to micromanage things. We're just trying to kind of drive it into a safe and appropriate use. The next one, I was going for like a cool saying here, and I kind of misfired here. Formularies are like snowflakes. I actually proved my point here. What I was trying to say is the myth that all formularies are drastically different and thus are impossible to navigate. And I wanted to address that just a little bit objectively, because back in 2019, we did an analysis and we looked at the top prescribing drugs. So just pure volume basis, we saw major alignment between, for example, us and fee-for-service. that came to about 98% alignment on those top products that made the vast majority of all prescriptions. And that's because most things that are generic and cheap, they're the things that are used most often. We've mentioned omeprazole before for heartburn, maybe gabapentin for nerve pain, lisinopril for blood pressure. All of these things that are most common, there's significant alignment on. So most of the time, there's that commonality. In that analysis, we found only one PA that CareOregon had that fee-for-service didn't, and vice versa. Fee-for-service had a PA on one drug that we chose not to. Where you do see a little bit more discrepancy show up is when you're looking at by paid amounts. Makes sense, more expensive agents, typically brands. That's where you get into a little bit more discrepancies in how health plans want to approach utilization of those products. We'll get into a little bit more of why that is in a bit. But this stands out where you got a little bit more, but there was still a lot of overlap. So maybe we don't cover all the same inhalers, but we cover a lot of the same inhalers. Insulin has stood out as one of those differences in 2019, but has also experienced massive change in terms of competition in biosimilars, which are kind of the generics of biologics. And so that space has already shifted and changed a ton in just the last few years. And so I want to ask, put in the chat the Bader-Meinhof phenomenon. Put in the chat if you guys know what that is. Anybody? Bader-Meinhof. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, like a drug name. I'm just going with conviction, Bader-Meinhof. And I feel like I learned about this from my wife recently. Now that I know what this phenomenon is, I find that everyone around me seems to really know what it means as well. Which, of course, is my terrible, terrible sense of humor that I think people love, but maybe they're just humoring me. That's the classic, you decide you're going to buy a white Acura SUV, and then you realize everyone in Beaverton has a white Acura SUV. So once you become aware of something, it's that confirmation bias. So I think that applies here with formularies, because it picks up on the PA process and some notable categories, diabetes, inhalers. It makes it stand out, I think, that this disalignment between formularies is a huge problem. But I think when you step back and you look at it objectively on a volume basis, it's not as big of a problem as it can show up. So that's not to say there aren't some tensions and issues that it can create, but just again, trying to put that into perspective a little bit. All right, now my really maybe getting a little bit more controversial slide, and I don't mean to take some shots at the FDA. I'll try to paint it in a fair picture because I think they have a very tough job. And we'll start with this idea that FDA indications are the gold standard in evidence. And I can tell you I've done a large number of PAs and appeals in my 11 years with CareOregon. More than once, I have seen a statement that's, I'm paraphrasing here, why do you think you know more than the FDA? And it's not to say that we think we know more than the FDA. It's just a different job that we perform than the job the FDA is tasked with doing. The FDA's sole job for drugs is to make sure that they are safe and effective. There is no role of the FDA in an assessment of value. In fact, cost is typically not even announced at the time a drug is FDA approved. It's not considered by the FDA. So obviously, as we're looking at things as they come out, we are strongly considering that value. What is the cost? And also, what is the relative effectiveness? How drugs get approved and what they're compared to during that FDA approval process, the majority are compared to literally nothing at all, placebo. And so there's often a real lack of evidence to tell us how new FDA things stack up against existing options. Now, again, that's a broad brush statement. Sometimes there are comparisons, though you also have to be careful with those comparisons. Are they fair comparisons? Did they study it against a drug with an appropriate dose? If I compare it to this blood pressure medication, but I only give a quarter of the expected dose of that blood pressure medication, is that really a fair comparison? If you now come out and say, hey, look, it was better. Maybe, but maybe it was better because the other dose was lower. Another common thing is to pick on kind of inferior options. Famously in dermatology, our group joked, everybody picked on Enbrel. Enbrel just seemed to always be studied against, maybe had a little bit lower evidence in some of the dermatology conditions. More recently, it's Otezla. But Otezla is not a biologic, so it's kind of an unfair fight if a new biologic comes out and says, hey, look, we are better than Otezla. So just noting, you kind of have to be careful with what it was compared against, and then how does that all stack up? Another question is really about the effectiveness itself. What makes a drug effective? And I'll give some examples. They're inspired by some real life events, but they're not fully, I can't tie them to a specific example for today. But let's say a new medication comes out and it's proven to reduce heart attacks by 50%. So half the number of people receiving a drug had less heart attacks. Well, what if that percentage was 2% versus 1%? So really that 50% reduction in heart attacks was 1% of all patients experienced less heart attacks. Now, maybe that's still good, right? We all agree avoiding heart attacks is a good thing. What if the endpoint was the reduction of LDL? So LDL, key part of cholesterol, often connected then to risk of heart attacks. I think for the most part, most clinicians kind of agree that reducing LDL has been shown in a number of drug classes, but not all drug classes, to reduce heart attacks. What if that LDL reduction was only 5 versus 50, or 50% versus 5%? Maybe not. Maybe we're less convinced now that that 5% reduction in LDL is going to produce meaningful benefit to the patient. And so the terms we use here are clinical significance. Are we actually going to see it making a difference to patients and patient outcomes that we care about? We care about LDL because of heart attacks and other complications. Statistical significance is what often trials are looking for and the FDA is looking for. Were we able to prove statistically that the impact was from the drug and not random chance? Now, sometimes these things are related, but not always. So let's take the extreme example now back to the heart attack to LDL. Let's say it reduces a key particle that makes up LDL. So let's say that particle is now reduced. Well, now what are we getting from that now? Are we seeing a reduction in LDL? We hope, maybe. And what does that LDL reduction show? Is that going to reduce heart attacks? I don't know, maybe. And what we see more and more often out of the FDA, I would say, are kind of falling into these categories. And they tend to be really rare conditions or really significant conditions where we've struggled to find effective drugs. And in some ways, it makes sense, right? Sometimes these things are easier for us to measure. We can measure them. It's easier to do trials. Maybe we can get those results faster. But the problem is that it's leaving a huge gap in that. What are the patient outcomes that we're going to see long term, and are those going to be meaningful? And that kind of segues then into one of my next comments here. And I wrote political entity, and I kind of wish I would have worded this differently. I don't mean political entity that it depends, who controls the Senate or the House, or what party the president belongs to. I don't mean that that's influencing which drugs are approved or not. But what I do mean is that there are pressures, societal pressures, patient advocacy pressures, maybe some legislative pressures that come in from constituents. So the FDA is not immune to those pressures and human decisions. And I'll point to a couple of examples here. So recently, a new Alzheimer's drug came out. The expert panel of clinical reviewers used by the FDA voted against, I believe it was unanimous, against approving that drug for the FDA. They had real concerns back to the plaque reduction on imaging and whether that was really showing effectiveness of the drug. So they had some concerns. We're not sure it's effective. What's been studied doesn't convince us it's going to be effective. And there were very much some safety concerns. And so they didn't feel it should be approved. The FDA essentially decided to disregard that expert panel's consensus and gave the drug FDA approval. And you kind of wonder, well, why would the FDA do that? Well, in some ways, it makes sense because there's a ton of Alzheimer's patients and families that are desperate for a treatment option. And you understand that desperation and desire and need to have access. Just try something, anything, please. Let's have that opportunity. So that right to try, that's a language that shows up and you may see in legislations. But the challenge is by giving that right to try and approving it from an FDA standpoint, it becomes difficult now to say, well, what implications does that have on society and payers? Because if we're not paying for drugs that haven't really been proven to be effective, And if the pharmaceutical industry is charging a large amount for those drugs, kind of like, what are we doing here? Like, why are we paying drug companies and allowing them to profit on something that they have not been able to demonstrate to be effective yet? And so I'm not trying to take an obvious position here of whether the right to try should exist or not. I'm just pointing out the tensions on both sides and some of the complications from an FDA approval. I absolutely 100% understand the desire and access to the drugs, but how we land on that kind of as a population and as a society and who should fund that, I think are really complicated questions. Another one I point out is OxyContin, and a quick shout out to the Hulu show Dope Sick. I am not paid for this plug. I am not friends with Michael Keaton, but it's a great show. Full disclosure, I haven't finished the series yet, and I've been bitten more than once by recommending something without seeing it all the way through. So I hope that's not the case here. But it's a really fascinating show and shows the influence of Purdue Pharma and OxyContin on the opioid epidemic. The reason I bring it up here is part of that problem that the show and the book it's based on highlights was how the FDA's labeling, suggesting that it was less addictive, was crucial in uptake and use of OxyContin. And when they look back to say, where did that language come from and who ultimately approved it? After that head of whoever made that approval, anybody know? Put in the chat, maybe you watched Dope Sick or you read the book. Where did that individual go to work after being at the FDA? Maybe some got it, Purdue Pharma. So this is kind of where I'm saying, again, there's human decisions, there's influence, and sometimes the FDA doesn't get it right, as was the case here with OxyContin. So I want to pivot maybe from so that was a heavy slide, and I want to pivot into maybe, well, part lighthearted, part heavy talk again. We hear a lot that pharma says, here's why we need to pay so much for drugs. You've probably heard all over the news about how the United States pays more for healthcare or more for drugs than any other country in the world. And the reason pharma will tell you we have to do that is because that's what supports these clinical trials and making the advancements for the world, essentially. And so I wanted to take a look. Let's look. I'm having a little bit of fun here at pharma's expense. Let's take a look at some of that innovation. And first, my Marshawn Lynch reference. So as Paul said, I do enjoy my sports knowledge and references. Marshawn Lynch famously, I'm just here so I don't get fined. I removed some of the specific drug names and manufacturer names because I don't want to stir any trouble, but these are real scenarios. You can go research them. I am, again, just relaying information I am aware of and not making any specific accusations. So please don't find me. First one, our team loved this one, Lime Pack. So as you can see a picture here in a bright green lime packaging, doxycycline. This was $810 for a 14-day supply of doxycycline, just in some really creative packaging. So these are the kind of things our P&T committee, we review everything coming out of the FDA, all the new products. And I tell you, every single meeting cycle, which we meet every 2 months, has a few of these examples. Existing drugs that just get reformulated into something fancy, new marketing, and a huge price tag. On kind of the sadder front, and again, some arguments on both sides here, a pretty popular medication was available as a sublingual tablet. Right before that patent was about to expire, and let me back up a little bit for those that don't know. The reason brand names are so expensive and the reason it's so expensive in the United States specifically are largely back to patent laws and the protection of patent laws in the United States. So these companies can get these very long exclusive rights to make these medications for an extended period of time, essentially giving them a monopoly to charge almost whatever they want. Eventually those patents expire. That's when generics can come out. You now have competition, multiple manufacturers, and that's where you can see the price come down. So right before this famous tablet is about to go generic, a study comes out. And the manufacturer says, we've decided that film packaging is safer for kids. It reduces the risk of accidental exposure to children. Now, maybe that's true, they certainly felt it was, and there was a study. And so they said, we got to stop making these tablets. We got to make them into the film, into the packaging. It's literally for the children, everyone. We must make it safer for the children. Now, critics would look to say, well, isn't the timing suspicious here? Right before the tablets are about to go generic, we're going to move everything into a film. That film has now patent extension rights. It can continue as a brand only for years longer than the tablets. If everyone moves to the films, then there's less substitution back to the tablets. So again, take that what you may. Maybe it was really safer. Maybe that was an appropriate move and not manipulation of the patents. A large advocacy group accused a drug manufacturer of essentially sitting on a known improvement on an existing drug that had some increased side effects in certain patient populations. And they accused them of sitting on this knowledge until the very end of that drug's patent life cycle. And then they said, oh, now we need this new formulation because it's safer. And so then they release it. And now today, that drug, the original, is available as a generic and has gotten significantly cheaper. The brand now exists and is marketed and is thousands of dollars a month. And again, there are some patient populations that can benefit. I don't think the entire population. So it's an example, again, where we have to kind of now try to leverage and how do we approach and which populations are going to benefit from the new dosage form. But I thought it was interesting that this advocacy group basically accused the manufacturer of sitting on that known advancement until the very end of the patent life cycle. So even when there is advancement, it can be manipulated for the industry's favor. Last one, another poll question maybe for you in the chat. Duixis, TID, this costs $2,500 per month. Maybe some of you know what Duixis is. That's actually not my question. I want to know what disease states you think should carry a price tag $2,500 per month. So if you just have any ideas, what severity, maybe HIV, Crohn's disease, maybe cancer, though you'd be drastically undervaluing how much the going rate for a new cancer drug is these days. But put in the chat what disease states you think warrant $2,500 per month. And now what Duixis actually is ibuprofen and famotidine. So an anti-inflammatory with kind of an acid blocker. And the combination, in theory, makes sense, right? There can cause ulcers and stomach problems from using products like ibuprofen, but you're taking two over-the-counter medications that are probably pennies a day and now packaging them as a brand-only prescription and selling them for $2,500 per month. So there you go, leading pharma innovation for you guys. And this is my last slide on kind of the why, because we've mentioned costs a little bit. And I just wanted to call out a couple more specific examples on this. And so Humira, when it first came out, was $1,100 in 2003. Currently, the standard maintenance dose is about $6,500. Though I would argue even worse, most of the indications Humira gets now, they are saying, well, we need to do it weekly. We can't do every other week. Now, if you're thinking that maybe they would keep the pricing the same, you're the same per month, even though you're using twice as much drug, you would be wrong. It is the same price per injection. So you're doubling the cost on some of these new indications that come out. Hidradenitis suppurativa is one of those conditions, so kind of a skin condition. I probably won't do a fair description of it. I think similar to acne and kind of in difficult areas, large nodules. And that now $13,000 a month to treat with Humira, which is just astronomical to me. GLP-1s, I mentioned later in our presentation, one of our common pain points. We've already seen those roughly double in cost from 2015 to now. The average cost per month, it's about $1,000 for GLP-1s. And when you look at the size of the diabetic population in terms of how many patients and members we have on that, that's a huge risk, a large complication of utilization. So can be a useful drug, can be a good drug, but is very expensive relative to the population, and that creates a lot of pain points and tensions. I want to spend a few minutes talking about kind of some other, just not direct costs, but some other components that influence costs. In rebates. I'm guessing the majority of you maybe have heard of rebates, but if you haven't, rebates essentially are kind of a behind the scenes deal between the pharmaceutical industry and either the health plan, the insurers, or the pharmacy benefit managers that basically say, we'll give you a discount if you prefer our drug. And I like to joke that brand drugs these days, it's like shopping at Joann's. My wife loves to go to Joann's, and I like to be hyperbolic about how excited I am when I find a 50% off coupon at Joann's. If you don't shop at Joann's, there is always a 50% off coupon. Things are always like significantly on sale. I think the same, the last time I was at Macy's was true. If you're paying full price for something at Joann's, you've made a horrible mistake. And that's kind of like brand drug pricing. If you're paying full price, you've made a horrible mistake. Unfortunately, not everybody has access to these rebates. So cash paying customers in particular, and even the CCOs to some degree. This is where the nuance really gets difficult. But the CCOs often are not getting significant rebates. Now, there are rebates that can go to the larger Medicaid on drugs. So I want to be clear on that. But it does create a difficult relationship to kind of understand how rebates are flowing and how that impacts costs. But the bottom line is we can say the CCOs, the majority of the time when we go to pay that brand, Farxiga, Jardiance, those claims, we're paying that full sticker price. We're shopping at Joann's without a 50% off coupon. Rebates also are a big reason, back to that formulary conversation and disalignment, specifically in brands. Well, this is why, because you have rebates driving and agreements behind the scenes with health plans. That's what kind of drives these different formularies, different motivations, different price points. Ultimately then can have one plan prefer this insulin or this plan prefer a GLP-1. And so it's rebates often that are driving that. Now, some of it's good because this is offering, a lot lower net price. And so the pharmaceutical industry will often point to this and say, drug pricing is not as bad as it seems because we actually have these rebates. These help reduce costs. And you end up with kind of a little bit of finger pointing back and forth. The industry says we have to offer rebates because insurers make us or PBMs make us. PBMs are saying, well, we have to get rebates because you keep raising the prices. And the finger pointing just kind of goes back and forth. It's the Spider-Man meme. We should have put that on the slide, Paul. The Spider-Man meme pointing to the respective Spider-Mans. And the problem is with that finger pointing, it's kind of a distraction. And meanwhile, America's kind of losing out, frankly. So they kind of escape blame by blaming each other to some degree. Maybe we're in on part of that, but it demonstrates the difficult realities of the pharmaceutical pricing world. I wanted to call out a shadowy aspect, another shadowy aspect of rebates. Thankfully, this is not really an impact for us because of how our copays are structured. But let me just give you a made-up example, but these are real instances that have happened. What if a brand drug came out and it cost $200, which is extremely cheap, by the way, for a new brand drug, but just to simplify. Let's say the pharmaceutical industry says, we'll give you a 60% rebate. We will give you $120 back. You only have to pay $80 for our drug. Great. What if at the same time, the insurer puts a 50% co-insurance on that drug? What are they paying 50% on? You're the patient, you go to the pharmacy, you're paying 50%. You're supposed to be going halvesies here. What's the Dutch dating? I shouldn't try to make that reference because now I forget what it is. But you're going to split it with your insurer. We're going 50-50. But wait a second. What if that 50% is on the $200, the list price? You're paying $100. Meanwhile, your insurer is only paying $80. You're potentially literally profiting off that situation, off copays of their membership. How prevalent this happens and whether this happens intentionally or it's just a byproduct of the system, I'm not going to take a position. I don't really know, but it is a problem. And it is something that legislation is looking to address because rebates can offer value, but we have to make sure that rebate value is getting back to the patients, back to the members. So again, with our copay structure at CareOregon with Medicaid and Medicare, we should never really run into this situation accidentally, but it is out there. So you may see it in the news. You may see some legislation changing to ensure that the 50% is on the $80, not on the $200, so that it's benefiting everyone. I mentioned 340B just for those that are out there. Maybe some of our attendees today are from an FQHC. And I just wanted to note 340B, if you don't know, it's kind of a federally drug discount pricing program. It's meant to help kind of these underserved communities be able to offer drugs for reduced price or no price to their membership without insurance or other kind of benefits just to help support the structure of these programs. I bring it up here just to note, just because a FQ8C can get a SGLT2 inhibitor for $5, it doesn't mean that the CCO is only paying $5. We may be still paying that full amount. And this kind of sharing of the cost savings is a very difficult, very complicated scenario. I'm not going to go into that, but I just wanted to be clear, just because your clinic can get it for really cheap doesn't mean it's really cheap for the payer. So just putting out there, I've heard that that's been useful for people to know, because it can be frustrating if you're looking and saying, why does CareOregon require a PA on this drug? It only cost us $4. So that can be possibly why. Last comment, and maybe I've gone a little bit over time with my riffing and stories. I hope you don't mind. Value. I've mentioned value before. I promised I wouldn't try to get too academic today, but just to kind of define some of these, cost effectiveness is kind of the classic term for value. Basically, it's an assessment to say, what are the clinical benefits we're getting for the amount of money spent? And obviously, this is difficult. Anytime you're trying to say, how much is a life worth? How much is 1 year of life worth? How much is an addition of functioning worth? That's complicated. That's gnarly to try to talk about, and especially on a patient level. But at a population level, I do think it's important that that's how we look at it, because that's how we get to sustainability. That's how we can try to serve a larger population, by making sure that what we're paying for falls within accepted norms of benefit. So let me give a made-up example here. Let's say a drug was guaranteed to extend the life of someone with a severe disease, let's say cancer, by 1 year. They're going to get 1 additional year of life. Let's say it's $100. Raise your hand if you think we should pay for that. Right? Of course, everyone, $100, an extra year of good life, absolutely, 10 times out of 10. What if that drug was $10 billion? Now should we cover it? What is the societal impact? What if instead of a rare cancer, what if that is 10% of a health plan's population has that? And so you can start to see where you go from an obvious scenario, $100 to an extend a year of life, to maybe tens or hundreds of billions of dollars. That's just not feasible. Money doesn't grow on trees, right? That from as when we were little kids, we've learned that. And that applies here, unfortunately. There's not an infinite set of resources. So if you agree there's an endpoint, it's just not sustainable, we can't do it, and an obvious point we can. The point is somewhere in the middle. That's where your cost effectiveness range falls. And so I'm not going to try to get into what that should be, but there are academic kind of set standards out there. I do want to note this is different than cost savings. Another one of these common things we see, oh, if we just cover this drug, there'll be cost savings. So cost savings means you're literally going to be paying less overall for a patient relative to the drug that you're covering. Those instances are extraordinarily rare, to be honest, really in all healthcare. So the benchmark is not to be cost savings, it's to be cost effective, to make sure that we are seeing positive clinical outcomes to our members relative to the amount that we are paying. And so one last example, I've mentioned the GLP-1s a number of times because it is one of our pain points. I'll mention them again. There is evidence out there about how they improve cardiovascular disease. I mentioned this a little bit before, where you have a % reduction in patients that have that outcome. Where it gets challenging is understanding the magnitude of that effect relative to the cost. So on paper, that sounds great. We reduced heart attacks or strokes. Excellent. That's the ideal, right? Well, if we say that reduction is just 2%, and this is in the ballpark, but I'm just using easy numbers for today's presentation. Say it's 2%. The way it kind of works in the math world, that means we have to treat 50 people to avoid 1 heart attack or 1 stroke. You may think that's good. You may think that's bad. I'm not going to say. Everyone's going to be a little bit different. But now let's say you have to do that for 3 years. That endpoint was at 3 years. So you've got to treat 50 people now for 3 years at $1,000 a month. And I'm not doing the specific math on those numbers, but when we've calculated it for all the GLP-1s, you're typically looking between $2 and $5 million spent on the GLP-1 to avoid 1 cardiac event. And so while avoiding that one cardiac event is good, that's a lot of money, it's a lot of resources to benefit that one event. And essentially, I bring this up as my closing point here, because that's the underlying tension, I think, between providers and the PA process and insurance on the PA process. Because at CareOregon, we're looking at the full population and trying to also meet the member needs, where providers are looking at the member in front of them. I want the best chance for this individual to not have that cardiac event. And that's where it can get difficult. And so again, I'm not trying to say what wins out or how things should be done, but just pointing, that's kind of my observation of the underlying tension, as we're trying to do the most good for everyone, because back to this funding, costs, it's either taxes for us, federal and state resources coming into us, it's members covered more or less, and services covered more or less. And we'll talk about that again, but at the end, that's kind of that's what we're left with. So if we can get the best value out of what services we cover, that allows us to cover more people, or it allows us to cover more overall services. So hopefully that makes sense. That's just kind of again, the underlying tension and the controversial space and difficult world here. And I went a little, maybe more than a little over my 40 minutes here. So maybe I'll try to make up some time. Paul, let me know if we need to kind of pick up the pace a little bit.
You're good, my friend.
We're good, Paul? Okay.
Absolutely. Charge ahead.
And feel free, because again, as you saw, even though we spent a decent chunk of time there, that's a lot of loaded topics, a lot of heavy topics, kind of hitting the highlights. So put some questions in the Q&A. We can try to address later if we have time.